It's Friday and we're ending the week. Um, Today, I want to do yet another review question with you. And then I want to begin by doing a little bit more on feudalism. Then we're going to look at the development of the second great institution of the Middle Ages in the West, and that is the rise of the Roman Catholic Church headed by the Pope. It is feudalism and Roman Catholicism which become the foundations of what we consider Western civilization. And if we have time, we can go on and look at the development out of feudalism of what we call the empire of Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, as he was called, at the end of the 8th century, beginning of the 9th century, during the Dark Ages. It's the one great political development of that period. So let's start with the review question as usual. We're really getting down the list now. Last time we looked at the question, discussed the relationship between imperialist expansion and class conflict during the Roman Republic. And I tried to show that there is this intimate relationship. The class conflict is controlled by external expansion. Well, the next question begins, at least, in a way that's directly related to the previous one. It says, it asks, how true is it to suggest that the Romans became imperialists by accident? Or in other words, the Romans really didn't mean to become imperialists. It just kind of happened. How true is that? Well, I think you would have to say it's only in a very partial sense true, because I've already shown that imperialism basically develops out of the class conflict within Rome. It's a choice. They could have resolved the internal class conflict in some sort of decisive way, or and that would have ended the necessity for imperialism. But no, they basically used imperialism as a way of assuaging, softening the class conflict within Rome itself at the expense of other peoples. So I think, as I say, it's only partially true. And on the other hand, one could say that they didn't exactly foresee that Rome would turn into an imperial power. And as a matter of fact, starting in the sort of 5th century, in Italy, Rome went to war against other Italian states. There was a competition for power between the different Italian states. Rome was just one of several rival states within the Italian peninsula. And these Italian wars, they were not necessarily imperialist wars. So they didn't start out that way. Rome was trying to survive in this competition. Well, as it turned out, it triumphed. By the end of the 4th century, Rome had become the dominant power on the peninsula. And then the same thing could be said about the wars that it got into against Carthage. The Carthaginians were rivals of the Romans for control of the Western Mediterranean. And if Rome hadn't defended itself, it would have been subordinated to Carthage. So in a way, it was a kind of defensive, these were defensive wars at the beginning. You could say that the first and second Punic or Carthaginian wars were defensive wars. That is to say 264 to 41 and 218 to 201. But after their triumph in the terrible Second Punic War, when they went to war again, the final time, they knew, that is to say the war of 149, 146, that Carthage had been fatally weakened, and this was a war of extermination and meant to sort of eliminate Carthage, or wipe it from the map. And moreover, it was definitely now an imperialist war. They, with a gleam in their eyes, they saw the possibilities of endless supplies of booty, of slaves, of treasure, and also, of course, of overcoming the class conflict. So I would say that overall, yes, there's a certain defensive element in the Italian wars and at the beginning of the Punic Wars, but overall, I think Rome was an imperialist power. Are there any questions about this question 25? Okay, very good. I want to now move on and begin by looking at feudalism. And I hope it was clear enough in the last lecture, but possibly it wasn't, because it's a very complicated subject. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend 8 minutes with this guy, and we'll look at what he has to say. If I could bring him up, I don't know whether I can get sound out of this. Can anybody hear this? I can't hear it.
No, we can't, or I can't anyway.
I'm going to skip it entirely. I guess what I would say is, in terms of reiterating what this feudalism was all about, the main thing I said was that essentially the peasantry, who may have started out as free German peasants, or they may have started out as slaves, they all ended up as personal and economic dependents of these lords. And the lords of the Middle Ages, they derive from the old Roman landlords and from the German nobility. The two basically fused together into a new ruling class. They were the feudal lords and the peasantry, who, especially because of the violence that permeated society, everybody looked for a protector and basically accepted the fact that they were serfs of these lords. And then the second point I made was that not even the lords were free from the fear of violence and anarchy. They themselves could be overrun by rival lords. Incidentally, there is a very, I find it interesting. It's called The Samurai on Netflix, and it's about Japanese feudalism, which is entirely comparable to European feudalism. And it's sort of a fun series, but it shows this, well, armored knights fighting one another to the death, basically fighting for power. And you can get quite a good idea of what the Dark Ages were all about by looking at this quite enjoyable film on Netflix called The Age of the Samurai. But in any case, to come back to this, these lords were themselves fearful, so they looked for overlords. And these overlords themselves, to protect themselves, looked for still higher overlords, up and up and up until you get to the king himself, which is to say that the kings, otherwise, the kings could raise armies through these relationships, because they couldn't field armies of their own because they didn't have any money. There were no taxes, there was no central government. And so what they did was basically they used the sort of feudal knights and this system of hierarchy to try and maintain some sort of control. So that's another characteristic of this system. I think that more or less explains what feudalism was all about. It was something that existed in lieu of actual political sovereignty. There was no centralized state. So you get this feudal hierarchy of armored nobility in lieu of a centralized state. But of course, it meant that sovereignty, the local landlords were also basically had political and legal control over their dependent peasants, because there was no central courts, there was no central bureaucracy, there was no central army. So the local lords had power. Is there any question about this? We could discuss it for a few minutes if you want to, if you need some clarification. It is a complicated matter. Now, the last thing I want to say about this is that I have described what we call Western feudalism. And I'm putting a lot of stress on this because in more or less, well, it continued right to the end of the Middle Ages, and indeed, in some form or other, right down to the French Revolution. And the European aristocracies who continued to have influence even as late as the 19th and early 20th century, they derive from this system. So it's they're very important in the history of Western civilization. So that's why I've stressed this. But what I want to say now is that this is Western European feudalism. But there are other feudalisms as well. I mean, the term, the description I've given you is peculiar to Western Europe. But I've already mentioned that Japan, the Japanese in the late Middle Ages and in the early modern period had their own version of feudalism, which is entirely comparable. And we could also say that Chinese society in the imperial period, or even Latin America under the Spaniards, and even later into the 19th century, can be characterized as feudal societies. In other words, sociologists, political scientists, and historians, they don't confine themselves when they speak about feudalism. It might mean Western feudalism, but there are these other comparable feudalisms that you should be open to. And I would say that the essence of all these feudalisms is that basically there is a great mass of dependent peasants who are basically not producing for the market. They're basically producing to feed their families. They're what we call subsistence peasants. And a landlord class dominates over them and basically takes a rent from these peasants. Those are the two fundamental characteristics of feudalism wherever it's found in the world. It's a very important sort of political social concept, but we're looking at European feudalism. Okay, that basically, unless there are further questions, I think I've dealt with that aspect of the Dark Ages. I want now to talk about the rise of the Roman Catholic Church during the same period. And let's begin with the Council of Nicaea in 324 AD, which I've already mentioned. It was called by Constantine, the emperor, as you remember, to settle the Arian controversy. There were over 300 bishops there from all over the empire. And these bishops who came from both the eastern and western part of the empire, now these people were not like the early apostles of the church. We're not talking about Paul and Peter or Thomas or any of the early disciples of Jesus. These people were powerful people, reflecting a considerable political power and increasing wealth. And I want to stress that latter point, increasing wealth. The church, by the time of the Council of Nicaea, had become quite a wealthy institution by bequests, by legacies, by endowments, which of course are not distributed by inheritance. They remain the property of the church. So it began to accumulate this property. And this is only the beginning, because the church over the Middle Ages, starting in the Dark Ages and right through to the end of the Middle Ages, accumulated vast amounts of wealth in the form of gold and silver, jewelry, but also, and even way more so, in the form of land. In some countries, they owned 30, 40% of the land. By the time you get to the High Middle Ages, it's owned by the church. So the church became the greatest landlord of the Middle Ages. And this was already beginning at the Council of Nicaea at the beginning of the 4th century AD. So these people were, as a result of that, they had great political and economic clout already. And then if you look 2 centuries later, by the 6th century, we know this from the records that exist. During the reign of Justinian at the beginning of the 6th century, there's been an analysis of the empire, and we find that these bishops had more wealth and were more numerous than the chief administrators of the what we call the Byzantine Empire. They were absolutely the most powerful individuals by the time of Justinian. So what I'm saying is that their power is getting even stronger. And so this is really the areas under the control of the emperors. But by the 6th century, of course, in the West, the barbarians have overwhelmed the Roman Empire. And there you see that the bishops, not only are they wealthy, but the barbarian kings who have taken power, they don't know how to read or write, nor do the warrior nobility, the landlords. They have the faintest idea about administering anything. And so it's actually in the West, it's the bishops who are, insofar as there any kind of administration in these barbarian kingdoms, it's the ecclesiastics, it's the bishops who are the administrators. They know how to read and write. They have some experience in administration. And so the bishops basically take over from the old Roman administrators. And so we say that the bishops are the last remnant move up. They're the last remnant of Romanism. They're the last sort of, as administrators with their dioceses. Remember, the diocese comes from, it's a administrative category of the Roman Empire. They carry over whatever is left of the Roman Empire is in the office of the bishop. Say Romanism, the Latin word, which in a way is better, is Romanitas, of Romanism, is embodied in the bishops. Furthermore, it is to be noted that these bishops in the West, in places like France or Spain or Italy, they come from the best families. They come from the old Roman landlord class, who are still there. These old families are still around, and some of their sons become officers of the church, because this is a powerful institution. It's not simply a religious institution. It's a powerful cultural and political organization. So it's an advantage to a family to have a great landlord family will make some of his sons into churchmen, because hey, they have lots of land, they have all this political power, so that's the way it worked. Now, this is what's going on in the church overall, but central to all this, of course, is the rise of the papacy. The rise of the popes is central to this whole process. The popes in Rome, especially the rise of the papacy is the reciprocal. It's the ghost. It's the specter of the decline of the empire and the disappearance of the emperors in the West. The emperors disappear, so the Pope takes the place of the emperor. That's basically what happened. Insofar as there was political power, the popes took it, and it was a combination of political power and cultural or religious power that the popes assumed. Now, the first important pope in this process is a character by the name of Leo the Great, who reigned from 440 to 461. Leo the Great. Leo the Great, of course, one of the things that he did was, when Constantine became a Christian at the beginning of the 4th century, you'll recall that the Roman emperors from the time of Augustus onwards were what is called Pontifex Maximus. The Roman emperor was the high priest of the Roman religion, the Pontifex Maximus. That title, amongst the other titles, Imperator, Princeps, Caesar, what have you, there was this Roman title, head of the state religion, Pontifex Maximus. Well, Leo the Great assumes that title. Yeah, the title had become defunct because Constantine basically gave up that title when he joined the Christian church. He couldn't be the Pontifex Maximus. Well, Leo the Great makes himself Pontifex Maximus. He's assuming the Roman dignity here. He's assuming Rome still has this this aura attached to it of being the center of the empire. And now Leo is taking over the title Pontifex Maximus. That's an important step. Furthermore, by this time, some of the emperors in the East, in Constantinople, have said, well, the Pope can be a judge in Rome. He'll be the supreme judge in the city of Rome. There's no emperor in the West, so I appoint the Pope. Let him judge cases in Rome. Let him administer certain aspects of Roman administration. Beginning with Constantine, they even give a certain amount of property to the popes in Rome. So what I'm saying is that by the time of Leo the Great, there is a growing administrative and even landed power on the part of the popes. But I want to stress that this is only the beginning of the power of the popes. There were other bishoprics in the Christian world that were the equal or even more important than Rome. So this has to be said, because we tend to assume, well, the Pope is the head. No, there were other bishoprics, as for example, Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch in Syria, the site of the early church, Jerusalem, and Constantinople itself, where the emperor actually resided. These, the bishops, were looked to as authorities equal or more important than the Bishop of Rome. So let's get this in proportion. It's only later that in the West, and only in the West, because in the East, the popes never gain authority. But in the West, in the absence of the power of the emperors, the power of the popes keeps getting stronger and stronger during the Dark Ages, as you will see. Thomas Hobbes, the philosopher of the 17th century, very interesting philosopher, sort of a student of Machiavelli. He said that the popes were the ghosts of the Roman emperors. That is to say, this is supposedly a spiritual or ghostly power. The church is supposed to be interested in religion, but the truth is that religion is completely confused with politics in this time. And certainly in terms of the history of the Roman Catholic Church, the relationship between politics and religion is extremely intimate. You know, you just have to go over to St. Boniface. It's a lovely area, probably the most beautiful area of Winnipeg, the area around the St. Boniface Cathedral. And you take a walk around there and you see, first of all, the vestiges of the cathedral, which of course burned down, but it's still there. You can see before the coming of the English, before the conquest of the Red River Valley by the Ontario Orangemen, This, of course, was this area was ruled by the first the French and then the Métis, and the greatest political influence was the Roman Catholic Church. You can see the enormous size of the cathedral, and next to it's very important to see that next to it is the palace of the bishop. Right next to the cathedral is the bishop's palace, because the bishop is not simply a spiritual power, he is a political power. And in the old days, he was a political power. And I'm using this as an example to give you at least some sense of what the popes, what the bishops were all about during the Dark Ages. In any case, that was Leo the Great. But the next great pontiff was Gregory the Great. And in some ways, he eclipses Leo in terms of his importance. He ruled from 590 to 604. From 590, it's a short 14-year reign. But nevertheless, extremely important. Oh, here it is. 590 to 604. Well, Gregory the Great, sure enough, what were his origins? He came from an aristocratic family, landowners from Rome. He was part of that landed aristocracy that I'm talking about that made their sons into bishop. He was one of them, and he became pope in 590. Now, why is Gregory so important? Well, first of all, he sent the first Catholic mission to England. It is during these years that a certain monk by the name of Augustine was dispatched by Gregory the Great, and he began the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons, the conversion of England. He went to the monarchies that existed there. The kings converted, and so necessarily then their people converted to the Roman Catholic. England became a Roman Catholic country under Gregory the Great. And he began the same process with the Germans. The Germans up to this point are pagans. He began another monk by the name of Boniface, later on Saint Boniface. Sure enough, that's Saint Boniface is the village within Winnipeg, named after this character. Saint Boniface began the conversions of the Germans. So under Gregory, the English and the Germans are, or at least most of them, are converted by Gregory. He wins them over to the Roman Catholic faith. And for that matter, even the king in Spain, the Visigothic king, whose days are numbered, they too were converted to the Roman Catholic faith. They went over from Arianism and became Catholics under Gregory. Furthermore, it's under Gregory, I told you that Leo had begun to create a kind of administrative political structure for Rome. Well, Gregory really completes this, because what he does, Gregory, is not only does he establish a political administration for what's left of the city of Rome, but the whole area around Rome, the whole of these territories now become part of what we can begin to describe as the papal state. A veritable new state arises. And this area, if you travel there, you see the agricultural land is extremely rich, and the popes are able to draw revenues from what they call the papal state. And the papal state is going to survive into the 19th century, for crying out loud. The popes remain princes until the 19th century, you're talking about a political reality as well as a religious one, the so-called papal states. So the conversion of Germany, the conversion of England, the establishment of the papal state is the work of Gregory. But then, last but not least, very important is the fact that Gregory's political religious ambitions are threatened by this new people who have invaded Italy. Remember, there was originally the Ostrogoths who come down in the 4th century. Then the Byzantines take back control at the beginning of the 6th century. Well, in the 7th century, I mentioned this earlier, this new people, the Lombards, intrude, and they're threatening what Gregory is accomplishing. So what does Gregory do? He sends a special mission to France, to the so-called Frankish king, the Franks, and there's a monarchy, a barbarian monarchy in France. And he makes a political and religious alliance with the French king. And together, the Pope on the one hand, and the French king, of course, who's further north, he's north across the Alps, they begin to squeeze the Lombards. They begin to put pressure on the Lombards, and they relieve the threat to the Pope. So if you add this up, Gregory the Great's accomplishments, Germany, England, Spain, and then the establishment of the papal state, and then finally the alliance with the French. And this last point is absolutely central, because in terms of the development of Western Christendom, the alliance between Rome and Paris, between the French and the papacy, that is the crucial nexus, that connection, political, religious, between the French kings and the popes is the central axis out of which the Middle Ages evolves, and even on into modern times, it's very important. So all in all, the accomplishments of Gregory the Great are enormous. Now, so that gives you, I talked about the rise of the bishops. I talked about the rise of the Bishop of Rome. And the last subject I want to deal with today is the development of the monasteries in Western Europe during the same period that we're talking about, the Dark Ages. The monasteries are extremely important, and they're extremely important in, the bishops are important in establishing the authority of the Roman Catholic religion. The popes are important, but the monasteries are at least as important as the bishops and the pope. And so I want to tell you about the history of the monasteries. And we begin not in Western Europe, but we begin in Egypt. Because what we find is that in Egypt, there was, even before there was a Christianity, before there was the Christian religion that established itself, there was a practice amongst the Egyptian peasants when the oppression and the taxes of the state, the Roman state, became too heavy. Some of the peasants in protest would basically, in desperation, they couldn't pay their taxes. The state was so oppressive and so on. What they would do, certain individuals would give up, and they would just abandon their families, abandon their homes, and they would become hermits in the desert. They would just flee for their lives into the desert, and they would eke out their days as hermits, as solitaries in the desert. They couldn't bear life. And so this was a practice. This is not religious at the beginning. It's comparable. Some of you who might know these things, we do have records here in Manitoba. People who find Winnipeg too much, who find farming too much, they'll go into the bush. They go to the white shell and they become hermits in the white shell. It's not a religious thing. They just can't bear it anymore. Civilization and the oppression that comes with it and the anxieties lead people to take to the bush. Well, the same thing happened under the Romans. But in the 3rd century, a certain individual by the name of Anthony, he came from a good family. He became a hermit. He left his family, he left whatever wealth he had, and he went out into the deserts. He would see nobody. He lived on bread, water, and salt, and sometimes on nothing at all. He just fasted for days, for weeks. He became famous for his suffering. He was a real masochist, this guy. And ultimately, he became a saint of the church. So much so that people were attracted to what he'd done. And this is in the 3rd century. And you find more and more, dozens, scores, hundreds of people basically imitating Anthony. He became, ultimately, he's known as Saint Anthony, devoting himself to basically contemplation of the elements of the Christian faith, Jesus, and so on, and living an ascetic life. Well, as I say, there were ultimately hundreds and even thousands of people who imitated Saint Anthony, so much so that it became, people were living in caves, in a kind of chaos. There was no control. All kinds of crazy things happened with these people. And so in the 4th century, the authorities of the church stepped in. They expressed admiration for the hermits, but they said they had to begin to live in a more organized fashion. And so the first actual monasteries, the hermits were organized into religious communities. We call them monasteries in the 4th century. And the 2 individuals were, most important was a sort of Greek Christian by the name of Pachomius and another theologian by the name of Basil. And these 2 people organized and wrote regulations for the first monasteries that were created in Egypt in the 4th century. And from there, they began to spread to various places in the Mediterranean. Well, finally, in the 6th century, in Italy, a certain individual by the name of Benedict of Nursia, came from a town in Italy, established a monastery at Monte Cassino in central Italy, up on a mountain. This is the first monastery in the West. And he wrote a rule. The monks had to obey his rules, or they couldn't be admitted to the monastery. And this monastic rule, became known as the Rule of Saint Benedict. And the monasteries that followed the rule of Saint Benedict became known as the Benedictines. The Benedictine order was established by Benedict of Nursia. And what was the rule? The rule was poverty, chastity, and obedience. Poverty, you're to have no personal property. Chastity, no sex, and obedience. You have to obey the abbot of the monastery. You cannot question. And this last characteristic is complete contrast to the sort of anarchy of the original hermits. No, the Benedictines are under a strict rule of obedience. One of their powers is this obedience to authority. So under this basis, the Benedictines flourished. These monasteries spread, we're in the Dark Ages, they spread in the forests. Hundreds of them are established in the course of the 6th, 7th, and 8th century. There are literally hundreds of Benedictine monasteries. And these monasteries, first of all, the monks know how to read and write, and they accumulate vast amounts of property, just like the bishops. They become immensely rich, and at the same time, especially the abbots, become real political authorities alongside the bishops. These Benedictine abbots become the advisors of the kings during the Middle Ages. So they play an enormous political as well as religious role in spreading Christianity, and I'll have something to say about this in a minute. But also another thing that happens in the monastery, the monks, of course, spend most of their time praying, or they're supposed to, but they also spend their time copying manuscripts. It's a kind of intellectual, low-level intellectual activity. Well, these monks sitting in the monastic libraries copy many of the works of pagan antiquity. The works of Aristotle, the works of Cicero, the works of Plato are copied by these monks onto manuscripts and preserved in these libraries. And that's the way they were passed down into modern times. So the Benedictine monasteries preserved a lot of the legacy of the ancient world and passed it on to modern times. So the monasteries are an extremely important development. And of course, they were adjuncts of papal power. They were firm supporters of the papacy. And the rise of the papacy is intimately connected with them. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week.